welcome back to the Wild Rose Moon's Moonlight series, featuring the talent that surrounds us all. This is part 2 with our guest Duncan Mitchell. John Baylor is back to host. I'm Ryan Meir, and here we go back into the moonlight.
Thank you for joining us for our second episode with Duncan Mitchell. Duncan's a native of the area, excuse me, but moved away, spent 47 or 48 years down in Bloomington, and just recently come back. Just about a year he's been back in the Plymouth area. And I want you to tell us a little bit about your time down there. When you were here for the first episode, we talked about your writing experience in second grade, but mostly in high school and in college. And then you kind of went through a spell where you weren't writing a lot, and then you had this other burst that came afterward.
Mm-hmm. I've often wondered why the writing dried up when I moved to Bloomington, and I think there were a number of factors, but one of them was I was busy living instead of writing, which is I think is
important.
A false distinction, because lots of poets manage and writers do both at the same time. But it just I didn't really think about it much when I stopped writing. After I'd been there about a year. And part of it was I didn't find the poetry scene at the university very welcoming. And so I was ready to think, I'm not that good, I'm not worth messing with it. Though if I had really felt the need to write, I would have. It was just other things were going on. And so after a few years, again, suddenly something popped up. And I actually began, when I look over the poems from that period, I find that I was struggling and trying to write before it suddenly really happened again. But the real thing was that suddenly I began writing what turned out to be a series of poems with the idea of a series or perhaps a book called Quadragesima, named after one of the poems, and it went from there. But I also began writing a lot of sonnets and just about anything that came to mind.
So there's two things. When you tell me this, I'm looking for the mystery of what causes these hot streaks and what causes these dry streaks. You mentioned one, during that dry spell, you just didn't feel a need to write, and I guess that means that in that high school and college time, and then again in the years that followed, maybe that means that you felt there was a greater need for it. Would you agree with that?
Perhaps, but as far as, in a lot of ways, the most productive period at IU South Bend was I had a lot of encouragement in the poetry class and from the other people in the class, and that certainly was a factor.
Yeah.
But the mystery of where it comes from, I've been trying to figure that out myself.
Right.
Trying to replicate what happened or how I found it, and it's if you figure it out, let me know.
Yeah.
I can say that I fell unrequitedly in love, and that seems to have been a factor. Though, as you'll see, the poems that I wrote out of that were not personal poems at all. And also, I've fallen in love requitedly and unrequitedly numerous times, and only that time did something crack open in my head. That was what it kind of felt like, was an opening up in my head that suddenly began spewing out poems, like lava.
Right.
And it was in some ways unpleasant, like being a volcano, that I was wondering, is this worth doing? Am I any good? It was kind of scary in a lot of ways. But I got a lot of encouragement from a couple of friends who were graduate students in English and who praised what I was doing, at the same time gave me critical and intelligent reading. But I also gave the poems to friends who were not scholars, not professionals, and because I wanted to make sure that they would get something out of it too.
Right.
And if someone said, "Well, I don't know anything about poetry," I'd say, "Great, You can read this and see what you get it from it.
Yeah.
And as long as I was pleasing both, I was happy.
Right. In high school, when we talked last time, you said that you had teachers who encouraged you as a reader. Did you have that same kind of encouragement, that same kind of people cheering for you in your writing during your earlier hot streak?
No, I don't think I showed the poems to anybody at that point. I'm not sure why. I just didn't. Didn't occur to me.
Yeah.
And there was nobody I particularly wanted to show them to. So I guess that I could think of. I had some good teachers, but I don't know. I don't think I don't remember feeling the need to show them to anyone.
Right. What would you say? There was a need to create them when you were in high school.
Yeah, but it was also more. Even that feels too strong. It's like, see if I can do this. Oh, I can do this. That's good.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. With Règne Animal, I knew I had something. Write something good. You often know this is it. This is going to be. This is something different. And I at least have no idea why, but still, or why I suddenly wrote something like this.
Right.
Again, if I could bottle that ability, I could make $1 million.
Right.
But it's also going back to the thing of being in love. I've been thinking a lot lately about people like to know where songs came from, like Joni Mitchell's "Coyote," Carly Simon's "You're So Vain," and the thing is, everybody's had those experiences, but how many people write songs that good
Right.
out of that experience?
Right.
And I was falling in love well and badly all the time, but only this time, that one time, did it give me 2 or 3 years of good poetry.
Well, I'll try to get into another poem really quickly. I will just say that there's a similar trajectory. Although I've written maybe I've had more hot streaks because you have like kind of these two periods in your life where you wrote a lot. I was very active as a writer in high school and starting before, but I just kind of increased in high school. I was just doing a lot of writing, and sort of tapered off a little bit in college, and just by the end of college, it just kind of fallen off where I wasn't doing anything, and I think there was an element of challenge, like you say. Let's see, can I do this? And there's a thrill that goes along with that. I think there's also a period in life where there are a lot of things you're trying to figure out, and music or writing. I mean, writing poetry is a way that you ask those questions about yourself. But then I went into this dry spell, and I know why I went into a dry spell, and it was because the hot streak is harder to explain, but I got to the point where I'd just written so much music and I wasn't performing it for anybody, and it just sort of felt like spinning wheels, like a total exercise in vanity to keep writing more and more music.
Yeah.
And I didn't really pick up and become active again until I started playing with a band and doing original music with them. And I'm still writing way more music than what anybody's ever going to hear. But now there's hope of an audience, not just through that band, but I've got other things going on now too, other opportunities. And having that community of people that are encouraging you, and even just having the gumption to shove it into people's hands and say, you don't read poetry? Great, read this. Even that, like you're finding an audience, and that makes your work matter. It matters when you're the high school kid and you're figuring out your life, but at some point I think it's got to matter beyond just yourself, or you give up on it.
Right. Well, I wasn't trying to. I wasn't giving the poems to non-poet people to get an audience. It was more to like a focus group, what does this say to you?
Right.
Is it fun to read? Is it? I think that most of my poems have a relatively conversational tone, and that might be one of the problems with them. The editors of a college magazine I submitted to at IU said that it just wasn't. It lacked a certain energy, which might be true. At that time anyway,
Yeah.
And in that poem, but I think the energy had a different kind of form, and I wasn't really trying to be an Allen Ginsberg,
Right.
with a wild, barbaric yawp kind of thing like Whitman. I was aiming for a different kind of voice, and by that time I knew that there were a lot of poets like that.
Right.
So I just wanted to know can you get pleasure from these even if you haven't read a lot of poetry, even if you're not very knowledgeable about poetry? Because for me, even if I didn't have an audience, the idea was still the poems are there for other people, and I'm interested in what other people get out of them. I quickly saw in open mic poetry readings and poetry readings generally that a lot of people would get up and introduce a poem at great length and tell you all about it and then read 4 lines, and that was it.
Right.
And I did my best not to do that, to give no more than the bare minimum of necessary. Because if it wasn't on the page, if it wasn't in the poem, then it wasn't good enough.
Right.
And so again, when I handed people poems, I didn't say, this is what I was trying to do. I say, what do you get out of this? What does it say to you? And that to me was the important thing.
I have a question from a viewer.
Yes.
Cynthia Boehner, she says, both of you mentioned having an audience or someone you felt wanted to hear your work. How critical is that to your creative process? It's to both of you.
Okay. It certainly helps. I mean, the audience for my poems in the 70s were mainly those 2 graduate students. And the fact that they were so enthusiastic about what I was doing was all I really needed. They didn't. It wasn't enough to carry me beyond a certain point. After a while, I still ran out of things to say. But certainly, you don't need. I didn't need a big audience. Maybe some people do, but I didn't. I was still kind of torn. Like I was comparing myself to Auden and Eliot and thinking, am I good enough? Am I as good as them? If I'm not, then I'm not going to bother. John, what do you have to say about that?
I made a comment on it already in terms of I felt like it was sort of a pointless exercise if there was nobody that I was reaching with it. But at the same time, I could add to that searching that I characterize as part of my high school writing. If that part is absent, then it's like it's equally vain in a sense. And I have songs that I come up with and I think, oh, this is a great idea. And now all I've got to do is put this into a song and communicate this idea to people, and won't that be wonderful? And I write the song, and I'm never pleased with it, because like if the center is just in the audience, then none of the center is in me. It's not not that it has to be a personal life story that I'm telling it or anything like that, but it's got to be something that affects me, and the reason that I'm sharing it with other people is that it affects me.
Right. I know if I'm writing something, I mean, if you're writing music, you should, or even poetry, you should always be thinking, well, this might be the best thing I've ever written. Like that's why you pursue it, kind of. If you know it's not as good as your last one, maybe you'll put it away and work on it. But if you think it's the best thing you've done, I want people to hear it. You want to get it out there. So yeah, it's important. But even if I show it to, if I play it in front of 20 people and one person comes up and says, you know what, I understand what you're saying, whatever, that's enough for me. My thought that she didn't ask about.
And one thing that connects to that was that the friends of mine in South Bend, the folky musicians I was hanging out with around IU South Bend, they liked my poems. A lot of them did. And I found that when I wrote something that felt maybe too personal, that it was too far out there, too unique to me, too idiosyncratic, those were the things that people would say, I felt like you were writing about me there. That was the ones that people would connect with.
Really specific.
So that taught me a lesson that I should always take that risk and write personally the stuff that I thought nobody else thought about or felt, because that was most likely to connect to other people.
Cool.
the stuff that you think about that you think nobody else thinks about, people do think about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the reason you think they don't is because nobody talks about it.
Could
and
be.
that's what makes it
Mhm.
meaningful and makes it a connection to them, because I feel the same way and I've never heard it expressed, but you expressed it for me.
At the same time, I couldn't tell you for sure that they were responding to the things that felt most important to me. It may be that
Definitely.
what they felt, what connected to them, might have been something else. I didn't ask them. I was just glad that it was useful to them.
Right.
Useful is one of my big words, one of my important words. That what I write, no matter what, should be useful to other people as well as to me. It has to be useful to me. It has to be something that I feel. And one of the interesting things for me about going back over my stuff now is that I still like it. It's still if I found this in a book in a book in the store or in the library and picked it up, I'd go, wow, this is good. This is what I want from poetry. And that seems to me the most important thing, is that it should, or one of the most important things is that it should also be something I feel is good and that I'm proud of, and also that I can connect with now, 30, 40 years later.
Yeah.
I used to, if I'd hear an interview with a musician or a writer, and the interviewer would say, well, what's the meaning behind this song or whatever? And it used to tick me off. They'd say, I really don't want to talk about it. I just want to let people think what they want. And I want to know what they wanted to hear. Now I kind of get where if they put it out there and say, well, it's about this dog I had, and somebody attributed it to some life-changing event that helped them, they're kind of keeping it, what do you want to call it? Keeping its value to everybody instead of singling it out. So it's neat.
Yeah, think of the Beatles song "Martha, My Dear," which is written to Paul McCartney's dog. And again, most people have got dogs, but how many people write a song that good? It's not even his greatest one, but it's a good song. And that's the hard part, is to take those feelings, those ideas, and make them into something.
Yeah.
To make an artifact out of them.
Well, also, one way that we measure what is great literature, that, I mean, not just, an academic person, but just, somebody that sits on his couch and has preferences in old TV shows or whatever. One of the measurements that we use is you can keep going back to this over and over again, and every time you get something out of it you didn't get before.
Yeah.
And if you interpret everything for the audience, then really what you're doing is you're cutting off all those meanings and reducing it to one meaning. So it's like it's less of a poem or a song or a story, because you told people what it was about.
Well, people are also a lot of people have learned to think of poetry as a secret code you have to learn to decode, and they want to know what you put into it that they should get. Which is why I would certainly ask them first, if they ask me what it's about, I'd say, well, what does it say to you? And then I'll be glad to tell them. I mean, here I'm sitting talking a lot about what I put into those poems and why, though I don't think it comes to a full explanation. But still, if somebody gets something out of it that is valuable and useful and makes sense on their terms, that's good. There's a writer named John Barth who said in an interview once that as far as criticism went, he would read a lot that would on his work. It would say, no, that's not it at all. That's not what I did. That's not what I was doing. That's not what I meant. But every so often, somebody would write something and he'd go, oh, yeah, that's there. I didn't know I was putting it in there, but yes, it's there.
Right.
And that's always great when you get it. So I would never tell someone not to read what they want from it. But one of the problems I think we get is that we need to learn how to read. And you learn that by reading.
Right.
There's a British poet and author of children's books, Michael Rosen, who has written a lot about teaching children to engage with poetry and then to write their own. And that's basically how you do it.
Right.
But you don't have to be Auden. You don't have to be even Michael Rosen. But you learn by doing it, and you learn it not by. It seems to me that the poetry that we read in our textbooks when I was in school was mostly totally unmemorable. It was as if it was chosen to be unmemorable. And I think that's why a lot of kids don't come out of school with an appreciation for poetry.
Yeah. Well, we've been chatting for a long time, which it's been a great conversation. But I do want to let you showcase a few of your poems. Now, go ahead and pick something out for us. But we covered a lot of ground in terms of one, your voice, which some readers, you said, felt like it didn't have the energy level that they wanted. Some of the when you were trying to get in with the poetry scene in Bloomington, and then we also talked about a poem that's valuable to you and is useful to other people. So just with a few of those things in mind, why don't you pick something else, something out?
Well, then, as far as that goes, this is a short and dreadful poem about love. What else? When you lie awake wrapped in your caftan without a comforter, alone like an abandoned baby tangled in a shawl, think of the moon locked in its orbit, in the scorching vacuum and darkness, with always the same face turned to the earth, unable to look away, unable ever to come nearer. This is a short and dreadful poem about love. What else? And yeah, this is one of the personal poems. Very, very much personal. Very much addressed to my muse, and about. But in poetry, often, as in all writing, when you say you, you're not just saying to you, but also you in the sense of oneself. Talking about it's me as much as any other person.
Right.
But this one is still. This is one of my greatest hits. This is a poem of mine that I'll go back to, and that always sticks with me. It's almost as if I didn't write it. It's certainly if I found this in a book of poems, and I'd never seen it before, I'd go, wow. This is a poet I need to follow.
Yeah. Well, you sort of mentioned going back through your old poems and enjoying it, and when that was in our discussion of writing for an audience, and then you sort of get to describe yourself as an audience. Years later, you get to be the audience for your own works.
It's one of the great things about getting older with all my writing, including my nonfiction, my essays and such, is to go back a few years later and read it with detachment. And still say, yeah, this is good. I'd buy a book by this guy.
Yeah.
And that's a good feeling, because often in the moment you don't know whether it's any good or not.
Right. Now you got that refrain in that poem that certainly captures that conversational tone that we were talking about earlier. What in there? I also mentioned before when I asked you to pick out a poem, get something that's maybe is something valuable to you and that you hope would be useful to other people. So in what way with this poem would you say this is one that's valuable to you, and in what way might it be useful to someone else?
To me, it just connects the feeling of loneliness, isolation, alienation, which probably everybody, certainly most people, have felt at one time or another. And with a bunch of images about, particularly the astronomical images of being stuck out in space and far away from anyone or anything else, and feeling lost and abandoned. I packed a lot of good stuff into, let's see here, 11 lines, something like that, 11 lines. And for all that I'm a very wordy person, most of my poems are very short.
Yeah.
And I'm proud of the fact that they do have a lot in them, I think. If they don't, then I don't show them to anybody else.
Yeah.
But the good ones too.
I feel in my writing there's some tension. There are things about myself that I want to capture in art, and there are things that it's like I don't want to be this person in art. I don't want to be the wordy person. For example, I can use lots and lots of words in conversation, but I need to discipline myself to reach that. I mean, it's like a different part of yourself that maybe you're getting in touch with by being brief and to the point.
Well, most of the poems I had read and liked were relatively short, and had, I thought, relatively had vivid language, and I think that one, the short and dreadful poem, which that just that one line. This is a short and dreadful poem. A number of poets have done that kind of self-referential thing,
Yeah.
announcing the poem in the poem, and another grad student I knew had done something like that in another poem, and it was not so much borrowing from him as thinking, oh, that's a good idea. It's like the Memphis riff, you know. That's a way to begin. That's a way to write, to introduce yourself and to draw people in.
Mm-hmm.
Because short and dreadful. Dreadful is, I think, not what people would be expecting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of. It comes across. It sounds like an insult to the poem, which is not exactly what it is. But
Right.
it sounds like here's a bad poem.
Yeah,
You're not going to
exactly.
enjoy this, right?
Exactly, and that's part of that's part of what poetry is. I was just when I listed my influences in the bio, I forgot to mention Richard Howard, who is a poet and translator. And last night I had just gotten a collection of his poems that I hadn't owned before, which had a number of poems I've been looking for these, and I realized that these poems were written and published just before I began writing again. And I'm not sure how conscious of it I was. I stole a lot from him in terms of wordplay and double meaning, and that poem has something in common with him in that respect.
Yeah.
Words, packing in as many words with doubled edges as possible. Though he usually goes on at much greater length.
Yeah. Well, why don't you follow that one with another poem? We haven't heard too much of your poetry so far this year.
Okay. Then here's a longer one. And this is also one that I'm very fond of, for better or worse. The Gilt Museum. Yes, I've lived here in my Gilt Museum quite a while, rocking endlessly in my mother's chair, surrounded by these little trophies of my past. Here, let me show you a vintage faux pas. Gaucherie 1956, bottled even before I had entered kindergarten. Or something in a classic 1959 mistake. The chrome still as dull as the day it came off the production line. The tires flat and dusty as a crone's breast. Sometimes the passage of time imparts a kind of deceptive polish to these old wrecks, the way a suit gets shiny from wear, you know. And I have to spend a good many hours in the lab restoring them to show just how bad they really are. Perhaps I could perform a musical composition for you, one of my early forays into dissonance. D.C. Mitchell, Opus 17, 1962, Rondo for Solo Stumble. There's so much here you could spend days going over it. I do. And how about this unfinished mural depicting, or attempting to depict, that time back in 1964 when I failed miserably to... You're not leaving already? What a shame. Well, it was time for me to consider dusting my treasures and to think about what the future holds for my little collection here. Why, I've barely filled up this one room so far. Can you imagine what I'll have in 10 years? Sometimes I just sit here rocking all evening, running my hands over some fine old blunder and daydreaming, you know. You have to pay attention to these antiques, or they wither and die after a fashion. It's almost as if they were alive.
I like that.
A lot of self-mockery, obviously. I wanted to be funny about it, but I'm a guilt junkie from way back. But then how often do you take guilt and make a poem out of it?
Mm-hmm.
Or particularly a joke out of it?
What's since we're sort of playing with this topic of the value to you, what's the value? Not in returning to your guilt all the time. You could address that, but what's the value in making a poem out of that?
It gives me distance from it, and maybe someone else would read it. And again, here I'm thinking, here I'm really dwelling on something personal. My tendency to not so much deliberately dwell on things I feel I've done wrong, but my inability to forget them. And maybe at the same time that it makes me giggle to turn it into a joke, maybe someone else will also get the joke and be able to laugh at their own guilt.
You
So-
had you had some unfinished. I was going to
Yeah.
depart a little bit from the
Yeah,
topic of
go
the
for it.
poems. Okay, some unfinished art in your Gilt Museum, and I wanted to return to the idea of these periods of productivity where
Mhm.
you produce a lot of work,
Yeah.
because you mentioned that maybe in the early '80s was the end of your hot streak that you had. And since that time, you've not written much in terms of poetry. You've written other things in terms of reviews, nonfiction writing. But does that have a place in your Gilt Museum that you're not creating art, or is that something you're very much at peace with?
I'm pretty much at peace with it. When I look at this stuff, I wish I had done more of it, but at the same time, I knew by the time I stopped writing that I'd run out of things to say, and I didn't want to go on trying to write. I mean, I also, at the same time, I was trying to push it. I was trying to keep on producing, and I was coming up with some stuff that really didn't satisfy me. So rather than keep on doing that, it was better to stop. The last poem I completed took me a year. I kind of wrote about 10 lines of a sonnet, maybe, and then kind of drew a blank, hit a dead spot, and a year later I was able to finish it, and that was it. I've started several. I've got one poem from I think 1991 that I almost included in this batch. I was going through old papers looking for some things that I hadn't been able to find, and it's okay, but it's not that good. So I don't really feel any guilt or anything bad about it. If I had had something to say, I would have said it. And I've been very productive in other kinds of writing, and that feels good. If I
Yeah.
run out of things to say in prose, then I'll just read and listen to music, and maybe I'll be able to start making music again.
Yeah.
As a musician, I write very few songs. I mostly just cover, do other people's stuff, and that's fine with me.
I don't know. I'm getting something about driving down the road from George. But okay, so you say you don't have this sense that you should be writing. If you're not going to be creating good poetry, then you don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be making bad poems.
Exactly.
But you have this drive to I don't know if perform is the right word, but I mean you've been coming to the open mics when we were having those regularly. Is that something that comes in streaks as well? Have you been reading your poetry all along, or are you now feeling a tug that this is something you should be doing?
No, I had an opportunity. Through the period when I wasn't writing poetry, I was making music, and that usually took the form of just sitting outside on campus and playing. And if people wanted to stop and listen, they could. If they kept on walking, that was also good. But it was different from sitting at home and playing, because there was still people who would hear me,
Right.
and people who recognized me after time passed. But it's just a sharing of things. I really don't like sitting at home and playing by myself. I want to be where other people can hear me. I was in one band that was doing very promisingly, and then our lead guitarist left for L.A. to find his fortune, and we weren't able to put it back together. And that was a drag.
Yeah.
So I just went back to making music by myself, and that was good.
Right. And so that longing for an audience comes back in to that discussion of music as well.
True, but I mean, it is nice to know that you're being heard, and it's nice when somebody responds to it. Again, I don't care if 100 people walk by me without stopping, if they don't notice. But if one person does like it and stops to talk and stops to listen, that's my need for an audience is pretty modest.
Right.
And so when I moved here and there were the open mics, that was an opportunity. I would rather have been making music, but I had not been playing in a while.
Yeah.
So I went with the poems instead. And I felt kind of guilty, if we're going to talk about guilt, about dragging out stuff that was 30 years old. And I kind of hoped maybe I vaguely hoped that if I read these things and had an audience, I might start writing again. But it hasn't happened so far, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, one philosopher I like, Walter Kaufman, pointed out there are artists who just go on producing art throughout their lives, and they keep on going forever. There are others like Rimbaud and so on who stop and then go on living, and because he didn't want to do it anymore, and he didn't have anything to say, had various reasons. Maybe he didn't entirely know why. So, having run out of things to say, I'm perfectly happy to stop.
Yeah. Well, we haven't quite run out of things to say, but we are going to have to stop.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I could get you. We've dealt with the nature of being heard a few times throughout the conversation, and I was hoping I could just get you to read one more poem, and we'll just end it on the poem. This is a poem for the person that this person is for.
Okay.
When an audience,
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like it's not what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And we won't get a chance to discuss, but still seems like sort of a fitting note to end on in a way.
Let's see. Shoot. Okay. Sorry about this, folks. A poem for the person that this poem is for. I always hoped I could seduce you by singing a love song, opening myself up so wide that you would fall into my heart, focusing my delivery so tightly that you would be waiting for me after my set with a readiness in your eyes. And here you are indeed, but only to ask for my autograph.
Thank you very much, Duncan. It's been a wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed having you on.
Thank you, John. I've had a great time.
This has been the Wild Rose Moon's Moonlight series featuring Duncan Mitchell. Thank you, Duncan. Very informative evening. Let's not forget our sponsors. Sponsors to help this thing get going every other day, every other week is Gibson Foundation, Gibson Insurance, Marshall County Community Foundation, Marshall County Tourism, and Encore Performing Arts Center. Also behind the scenes, we have George Schricker, John Baylor, Howard Gibbs, Matt Bergmoser, Jennifer Reed. I'm Ryan Meir. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.